thank you so much for being here today. And most of all, thank you so much for giving up your spot in the sun outside to come back, sit down, and come on this journey with us to learn about sustainable growth. I'll be joined shortly on stage by my formidable colleague Marie Loredan, and later by the amazing Andy Carvel, formerly of SoundCloud. But first, let's talk a little bit about what this session is about. So what do I mean by saying sustainable growth solves most problems? And I'll tell you a little bit about my goals. So my first goal for today is to introduce all of you to a very simple yet powerful framework that you can use to systematically accelerate the growth trajectory of your app. And the second goal for today is to share with you some insights of partners or developers that some of them are in the audience today that are using growth tools, techniques, and tactics to accelerate their app. And hopefully you'll walk away inspired and try some of these methods yourself. But first of all, let's all accept the growth challenge. So what do I mean by that? I want you to come on a journey with me to kind of understand the importance of having a structured approach to growth for your app. Let's have a show of hands here. Who in the audience here considers her or himself a growth hacking expert? We should have at least one, because we have Andy in the audience. Oh, okay, I see you're all shy, maybe still very full from lunch and hopefully not half asleep yet. Okay, so we don't have any growth hacking experts. That's excellent. You came to the right talk. So, expert or not, I hope that you all agree with me when I say that one of the important factors in why growth or achieving sustainable growth in the long run is so difficult is that the individual tactics and tools and techniques that people are using are not only complex in themselves, but importantly, they're also very interconnected. And so it's tempting to obsess about one or two or three individual tactics and master them, but kind of lose sight over the big picture. And so, for example, let's look at performance marketing. So there was a recent study that showed that marketers are using dozens of channels and ad formats to reach their users. So this is just looking at paid marketing. And for me, that already looks like a very, very complicated subject to master. So just performance marketing. But of course, we haven't even thought about or haven't even looked at all of the organic ways of driving users to your app and the interdependencies between those. Also, for us at least, or when I think about growth, growth involves much, much more than user acquisition. So, in fact, I'm certain that almost all of you here in the audience today are working on strategies to better engage and retain users. In fact, at a recent Play event earlier in the year, we did roundtable discussions, and their developer, almost every single person I talked to, told me that they obsess about the onboarding experience in their app to make sure that people or that new users sign up or activate push notifications to then later be able to target them better with lifecycle marketing campaigns. Now, those are just two things, so onboarding experience or first-time user experience and lifecycle marketing, but there are a lot of other things that people are doing to drive growth in engagement and retention and ultimately usage of their app. And of course, eventually, all of us will care about revenue or growing revenue. But of course, how much you focus on revenue depends on sort of the life cycle stage of the venture that you're working on or the maturity of your product. So one way that people are optimizing or growing their revenue is by optimizing their pricing strategy. But it's much more than just deciding on a price. So developers, like top developers like Netflix, they're using a lot of very subtle strategies, and they're experimenting with things like price tiering and price anchoring to influence purchase decisions. And a lot of you are doing that as well. So pricing is only one of the many things that people are thinking about when they're thinking about growing revenue. You know, you have to think about how do you capture value in the first place from partners? How do you have your offer strategy? How do you process payments? So I work with a lot of you and a lot of top partners personally on a lot of these topics and issues. And I think it gets fairly complex fairly quickly. And luckily, there are a lot of people in the growth hacking community, growth professionals, that are looking for ways to put some sort of structure on growth, on this wild field, on this complex topic, and trying to understand all the interdependencies and enable them to prioritize better and to ultimately accelerate their growth strategy. So one of these people will be on stage later, Andy, and a couple of people around him in the growth hacking community have been thinking a lot about one of these tools to structure growth. And I want to give you a very brief introduction to a growth hacking framework. So the first thing that you should do is actually to take a step back. And so just before looking at any of the tools, tactics, and techniques, think about your high-level business objectives, whatever they are. So if you're early in your venture, maybe you're just trying to validate a minimum viable product, or you're trying to double sales on mobile, or you're maybe looking for investment and you want to raise a round of investments. Now, think about how those high-level business objectives, what do they mean for your growth strategy, for how you define growth for yourself? And you will start to notice that you'll probably, without looking at anything individual, you'll probably be interested to focus more strongly on one of these three things. Maybe you'll focus on all, but it will sort of give you an initial idea on where you might want to focus. Also, of course, important are not just your business objectives, but also your resources and your constraints, and I'll think about that a little bit. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So let's talk about how to apply that. So, tactics. All the things I mentioned earlier are your kind of tools, tactics, strategies that are available for you. To you. So when you, and this by the way, is not an exhaustive list. There are many, many other things that people are doing. But when you're evaluating an activity, think about how does this particular activity fit into my overall strategy? So you can do that for the activities that foster user acquisition or accelerate user acquisition. You can do that for activities that increase engagement and retention. And you can do that for growing revenue. And I'm not saying you should be doing all of these things. You should be looking at every single tactic in light of your overall objectives, your resources, and maybe your constraints. But then, once you have sort of assembled your tool set for growth, there's another important thing that you need to do. And that is build the right business intelligence tools and infrastructure to be able to track your progress. And I can't emphasize how important this is, because when you invest in these areas, you're using resources that you might use for other things instead. So you need to be able to track the impact that you're having, that your teams are having on these individual areas. So you might want to assign 1 or 2 actionable and measurable KPIs to each of those investments. So maybe when you're thinking about optimizing your playlisting, think about the visit to install conversion rate and how all the things that you're doing is impacting that in the long run. Or when you're thinking of your onboarding flow, define a metric that captures your activation rate, how good you are at activating users when they, how good you are at introducing the product to your users when they install the app. Or when you're thinking about growing revenue, you might think, okay, here's my payment here are my payment processors. What's the percentage of failed payments, and how can I increase the coverage when I enter new markets? So that's very important, the KPIs and having them measure and being able to measure them. Now, let's think of one, or I'd like to explain a very simple application of this framework. It's not, an exercise in pretty drawings, but think of the concept of a growth card, right? So you have you've selected the activities you want to do, you've got your KPIs and you can measure them. Now try to benchmark against either internal goals or industry averages. So you might actually find, let's go back to the Play Store optimization example, you might actually find that your conversion rate is actually very good compared to country benchmarks or industry benchmarks. You might find that maybe your activation rate is okay, it's not super great, but compared to the goals you set for yourself, it's quite good. But then you might find that payments is really an issue, and I'm just using these as examples. But this is how having a scorecard to guide your growth strategy can be very, very, very useful and helpful. So that's enough theory for one afternoon after lunch. Now I would like to talk a little bit about what are top Android developers doing with some of these techniques to drive growth. Now, I'll be focusing mostly on the organic techniques. That's what I do in my day job, and then Marie will come up and talk a little bit about paid techniques. So, first up, I'd like to talk a little bit about Clue. So this is a period tracking and female health app, and they're based here in Berlin. So late last year, we actually went through they went through an exercise quite similar to the growth framework that I introduced just before. So we were trying to figure out where are the bottlenecks, or which areas needed more investment to accelerate the growth curve on Android. And one of the things that we identified was that the install conversion rate was quite low, or was lower than it needed to be. So the folks at Clue really came up with a long-term strategy of running lots of little playlisting experiments to increase the conversion rate. And over the course of about 6 months, they increased the conversion rate by 24%. And that's huge. So that means that 24% more users install the app without spending anything more on advertising or doing any PR work or anything. So that's just with the users that are already arriving on the playlisting. So just to give you one quick test. So which of the two images do you think had a higher conversion rate, visit to download conversion rate? The left one or the right one? So have a show of hands for the left one, on your left. Okay, so that's the black one. Okay. And the others? Okay, yeah, so the white one, there's actually two factors there that got tested individually. The white phone was much more, drove a higher conversion rate, and the larger image. So that's a really, really cool insight here. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of the tool sets that you have available is an example from a nonprofit, which is Share the Meal, also based here in Berlin. And these guys, I'm sure, also did a very sophisticated growth analysis, but one of the restrictions that they have is that they're a nonprofit, so they can't actually spend any money on advertising. So they sort of evaluated their constraints and then thought, well, one of the things we can do, and we can do very well, is public relations. And I think it's a tool that's often overlooked because it's hard to do well, but when you do it well, it can be very, very powerful. So it's also hard to track, but they have to track their impact. So they estimate about 50% of all total installs were driven by public relations. And a couple of the insights there is you need to really focus on excellent messaging and having the right hooks, and also to combine public relations with other initiatives such as partnerships work, or maybe press work, partnerships, and maybe viral hooks, something like that. I also want to talk a little bit about virality. So I'm sure you guys all know Dubsmash. I don't know if anyone from Dubsmash is here today. I think so. No. Or maybe you don't want to say. So Dubsmash is a social video messaging platform. And basically what it does, it allows you to create videos of yourself that are dubbed, and you can lip sync to songs. And this is really, really fun. And in a way, virality is built into the product, right? It's not very fun looking at yourself singing along to songs. So you kind of, sharing and reaching other users is built in. And it has been hugely successful, and growth has been phenomenal. But the point I want to make is that even if virality isn't built into your product, so if your product isn't a perfect fit for viral mechanics, there are a couple of things that you can look out for to make sure that you make sharing as easy as possible. So there are really two factors. One is called, it has a very fun name, it's called the K factor. And it basically means, it describes how many new users does one user bring into the app. So that's something that you might want to work on improving by making it easier to share with other users. So that can have a really nice impact on your sort of organic growth. Another factor that you might want to look at is the cycle time, and that just means how short or how long is the interval between me sharing with friends and those friends coming back to the app or installing the app for the first time and then sharing again. So shortening that time can also be a very, very, very powerful factor of increasing the viral growth of your app. So think about making sharing easy, accessible, encouraging, incentivizing sharing. One final thing I want to talk about in this quick session is cross-promotion. So cross-promotion, if you already have a popular app, can be very, very powerful tool. So Virality did this very well. So for me, cross-promotion isn't just injecting an interstitial and showing it to all your existing users to promote a new product. But doing it in a clever way works very well. So for example, Virality injected nutrition information to the activity stream for all their body weight users. And so that got people who are just interested in fitness interested in nutrition as well. And some of them clicked through to the app. And there are various other subtle ways of using cross-promotion to promote a new product. And this was very, very, very successful for Virality. So when they launched the nutrition app, almost all of the sales were made to existing users of existing apps. So that's my part talking about organic tactics. I'd now like to ask Marie on stage to talk a little bit about performance marketing.
Hi, everyone. At Google I/O, we announced that mobile app install ads had driven over 2 billion installs. This number is now 3 billion. This is truly growth hacking. How did we achieve that? At Google, we take app promotion very seriously and have been heavily investing in building us the tools that will help you drive installs and also make sure that your users stay active within the app. You've heard earlier in the opening that we had launched universal app campaigns last year as a very simple way to actually show you ads on the full set of our inventory, which include Google Search, the Google Play Store, our Google Display Network, and YouTube. What you need to run universal app campaigns is only 4 lines of text. Then we do the rest for you. We generate creatives using your Play Store assets, and we use, for example, your app icon. Then we run the ads, and optimize them for you, automatically through our machine learning solution or conversion optimizer. So this has been extremely successful and helped a lot of advertisers to drive installs with success. Now, I like to do a show of hands, but because I feel the energy is a bit down after lunch, I'd like you to stand up if you already used paid marketing before. Can you please stand up if you've used performance marketing? So let's say about half the room. All right. Now everybody sit down, okay. So hopefully you moved and now you're energized again. Right. So obviously if you stood up or if you didn't, universal app campaigns is truly something I encourage you to look at. We have very sophisticated players using it in the industry and also smaller players. So this is really something I'd like you to take away today. Now, we're going to explore a couple of different campaign types that can be used and help you drive installs and app engagement. So the first one I'm going to talk about is video. So video campaigns are really good if you want especially to build up brand awareness, right? And also drive installs. For the most successful advertisers out there, we've noticed that usually videos would trigger users with higher lifetime value. Here, we have the example of musician. So if you want to become Jimi Hendrix tomorrow, use musician. You'll learn how to play guitar. What they did is they used videos in their ads campaigns, and they managed to increase their installs over 136% as a result. They launched the campaigns in over 50 different countries. A couple of tips to make sure that your videos can be very successful. For app promotion, you need very short videos, so that's the first point. We recommend less than 20 seconds. Second tip, make sure that you're showing the brand in the first second of the video. Third tip, you make sure that you also show the users how to use the app. So use a demo, very easily use screenshots from your app so that the user can understand actually what your app is about. Finally, and last tip for successful videos, make sure you have a clear call to action at the end. The users need to click at the end of the video to be redirected to the store and then install your app. With that, I'm going to move forward to the second campaign type I'm going to talk about, which is search. So search is enabling you to drive installs at scale and will allow you to reach users that are going to look for apps similar to yours. So here, you can see Get. Get is a taxi service application. They ran search campaign both on the Google Search Network and the Google Play Store, and they saw an increase up to 60%. I think in Russia, they saw lower CPAs of 60%. So this was very successful for them. And at the same time, they managed to exceed their return on investment by 150%. The next campaign type I'd like to talk about is once you've decided to go beyond installs. So we all know that user engagement and making sure that users stay active within the app is extremely important. So here the idea is really to shift from the installs to actually start monitoring and optimizing for in-app events or in-app activities. This example is the one of Happen. Has anyone used Happen here? It's a dating app, so, all right. So what they did is they actually decided to do that. They wanted to keep monitoring installs, but move a bit away further down the funnel and start optimizing for registrations. So they're starting building up display campaign to optimize for registration. And they managed to decrease by 68% the cost per registration in one of their most expensive segments, which was women over 25. So this really worked well for them. If I take other example, and I'm thinking about education apps today, then optimizing for registration might be important. Other things that you might want to optimize for is a tutorial completion, for example, or is also optimized for users who are reaching a certain number of classing within your app, or a purchase ultimately. Retailers, so the same. They will try to track different things and optimize for different things. For example, a product view. They might also want to optimize for a search performed within the app. They might want to optimize for an item added to a basket, and ultimately even go to the end of the funnel and optimize for purchase. Finally, the last piece I'd like to talk about is engagement and how to drive successful engagement campaigns. So for engagement, you need to be very clear with regards to the strategy you want to adopt. So there could be several strategies. If you're a gaming application, you might want to go after the users that have achieved level 5 within your game or above, because you know those users are going to be the most profitable for you, the ones driving the most lifetime value. You could also very simply decide to re-engage all the users who have already installed your app. In the case of Foodpanda, which is one of our Berlin-based partners, what they decided to do through their engagement display campaigns is to optimize and go after the users who had installed the app or who had already made a purchase. And this was extremely successful. 71% decrease in cost per install, and 37% more sales when they were comparing the results of their app campaigns to their previously run desktop campaigns. So it was very, very successful and paid off a lot for them. So with that, as a recap, a couple of ways to run paid acquisitions today and re-engage your users through universal app campaigns, video campaigns, search, optimizing beyond the install for in-app events, and finally, run re-engagement campaign. Thank you, and with that, I'm handing over to Max.
Thank you, Marie. So I hope that there was something interesting there for everyone, some inspiration, some ideas, or something that partners or developers here in the audience are doing. So I want to remind you, we're all here today, so let's chat. So if you found anything or heard anything that was interesting, I'm sure that Sebastian is very interested in chatting to you. Listen to his, or if you're interested in PR, he's an expert in it. So think about what was useful there, and think of how you can apply it to your project, to your app. Now, I want to recognize the fact that growth strategy doesn't happen in a vacuum. So it's very, very, very important to have a great team and a culture to support that. So we were talking to some of what we thought were very successful developers and experts in the area. So think of that. Of the 76 million total installs that Rantastic has generated on Play, 95% were generated organically. I think that is a phenomenal number. And the head of growth at Rantastic, Mario, he's very, very proud of that KPI, because it's a very good indicator that they're doing something right in their, with their growth team and with their growth strategy. So the first lesson, when I talked to him, the first lesson that he had for me was, if you want to do growth right, it can't be a strategy so much. It has to be at the core of the culture, and it has to inform everything you do. So what does he mean by that? Well, it means that their growth culture is codified in a set of principles at Runtastic. So one of the principles, for example, is growth is never done. Or another principle is maths and metrics don't lie, but they don't tell everything. So growth culture is encapsulated in these principles, and these principles then inform all the processes that people at how people at Runtastic works. It informs how the teams are staffed and what tactics those teams employ. So he shared with me this very high-level view of how their product managers, designers, and engineers work together to create their app. So, and I think it encapsulates well the principles at work. So it applies data, but it doesn't rely on data entirely. The feedback is also qualitative. And it also means that growth is never done, so you have these continuous feedback loops of how they do development. Another key thing I think that you need to remind yourself is that growth strategy is very cross-functional. It's a cross-functional endeavor. And so the quality of your execution will depend on assembling the right skill set and the right people in your team to actually execute well. So I hope that, as I said before, you chat to other developers here and really try to get to the bottom of how other people in the industry are set up to drive growth. One last thing I want to emphasize is the importance of continuously tracking your progress, whether you use a growth scorecard or some other device. It's important with successful growth strategy to flag problems early on so that you know whether the investments you're making are bringing you closer to the goals you've stated for your KPIs. And to also reevaluate your growth strategy continuously as internal and external factors change. So that was the first part of this presentation. Before I call on Andy, I just want to give you a very quick summary. So first we looked at how complex the whole topic of growth is, but then we luckily introduced a very simple tool, the growth framework, to deal with this. And the first step is to look at your high-level business objectives to define what growth means to you, for you and for your business, and then to really focus only on the techniques that make sense for you, the tactics and the tools that make sense for you. And importantly, be able to track the impact that you're having. Also, define really good KPIs for you that are measurable and actionable, and have some sort of way of making sure you visualize whether you're on track. And then to continuously look at the data as it comes in and track your progress to make sure you're on track and to make changes as necessary. Now, Maria and I, we covered the framework, we gave you some examples. I'm thrilled to hand over to Andy, who until recently was a product manager at SoundCloud, and he is currently a growth hacker. Please, I hope he'll share with you some interesting insights of how SoundCloud lives and breathes growth. So thank you very much.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful day, so thanks for being in here and not outside in the sunshine. So as Max said, I actually just finished at SoundCloud, literally on the since 1st of September. I'm now working with another ex-SoundClouder. We set up a mobile growth consultancy, so we're helping companies with exactly this kind of stuff, like applying the mobile growth stack framework, and also writing about growth topics at mobilegrowthstack.com. But I spent the last 4.5 years at SoundCloud working on mobile growth, and the last year and a half of that was leading a cross-functional team focused on user retention, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today and tell you why I think it's the most important growth metric, and just give you a little bit of insight into like some of the things that we did at SoundCloud to increase retention. So, retention. It's really scary when you look at this graph on the right. This is the graph that I often refer to. It was published by Andrew Chen in one of his blog posts. And it shows the average retention of Android apps in the Play Store. And it shows the blue line there at the top is the top 10, like apps in the top 10. And what you see on this curve is that even a top 10 app loses 50% of its users in the first 90 days. And if the app is not in the top 10, it's likely to be retaining users significantly poorer than that. It's a really tough game to retain users because the switching cost of for a user to switch to another app or just to discard your app is basically zero. So it's a constant challenge to keep your users engaged and retained. And of course, if you're spending money on marketing, it's really scary to think that actually you're paying to acquire users who are probably not going to stick around. So anything you can do to improve retention gives you compound growth over the long term. And yeah, it's going to also be a multiplier on your acquisition efforts. So at SoundCloud, the way that we looked at retention was, you can think about retention in terms of when you look at your users in any given period. So for example, here's an example from the May users at SoundCloud. They broke into these three different buckets. So you can think about, you always have some new users who've just arrived. And then at SoundCloud, we talked about repeat and returning users. So I'm going to just take a moment to explain the difference between those two buckets. So a repeat user is someone who was here in the last period, and he's here again this period, or she is here again this period. So this is a loyal user who is currently engaged and is using your app regularly. What you often find is that there's also a large bucket of what we refer to as returning users. So these are users who were not seen in the last period. So the period, let's say they were not seen last month, but they're here this month. But they signed up more than 1 month ago. And this bucket actually is usually pretty large, particularly if your app's been around for a while. And these users haven't necessarily churned in the sense of that they've really abandoned your app. They might just be very casual users who, maybe they use your app, once or twice a month or, a few times a year. And depending on your app and the particular kind of use case that you're solving, maybe that's okay. But probably most apps, you really want users coming back every week or even every day or even multiple times per day. So really, the way that we approached it at SoundCloud was that we wanted people listening to music on SoundCloud every day, preferably for many hours. And so really, it was all about growing that repeat user bucket, turning new users into repeat users, and then keeping them there. And then, reactivating users who had lapsed. But reactivation is really tough, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So how do we approach this idea of keeping users engaged, keeping users from dropping out of this loop? And it's the way that I sort of conceptualize it is that you're building growth machines. You want to build repeatable loops, processes, which through testing you've proven to have a strong impact or a positive impact at least on your retention numbers. So this could be, I'll talk about activity notifications as a prime example of this in a minute, but there are other things you can do. Could be a loyalty scheme that with points or gamification, something like this. Anything you can do that basically you can put it on sort of autopilot once that you've tested it and optimized it and iterated on it to a certain level, that it just keeps going and it keeps pushing some users into a higher engaged state and basically interacting with users ideally before they churn. And so I'll talk a little bit about activity notifications, which was actually one of the projects that I spent most of the last year really building up at SoundCloud, was to build out a new activity notification infrastructure for the company. So what are activity notifications? They're sort of real-time notifications. Could be push, which was actually the first channel that we deployed them to, but can also be over email, could be SMS. The channel is less important, I guess, than the concept, which is that you're getting in touch with the user to tell them something hopefully interesting and relevant to them in a timely fashion about something that's happened when they're not in the app. Now, this is not always applicable to every app scenario, but at SoundCloud, for example, there are plenty of things that happen when you're not in the app that you might be interested in. It could be that artists that you're following have released new tracks, and you might want to be told about them because you might want to come and listen to them. Could be that I've created a playlist and somebody has interacted with it, somebody has liked it or reposted it somewhere. And so these kind of like social interactions, social signals, or just new content. New content is a great one, and it's definitely was the highest performer for SoundCloud in terms of being able to tell people that there's new music that you might want to come and listen to, was fantastic in terms of performance. So, I mean, just to give you some idea, with the new notifications that we rolled out, we built out like 5 new notification types, and like between that combination, we were able to increase retention by around 5%, like absolute percentage points, which is yeah, pretty significant. So, like, what did we actually build? It's more than just coding like these notifications to say, okay, tell the user that something happened. Like, what we actually wanted to build was a measurement and experimental framework around that, such that we're actually able to test and iterate on these notifications and to measure the impact. Measurement is really a tough thing with retention because everything affects retention. Like, you know, any product change that you make is likely to affect your retention. Your acquisition mix will also affect your retention. So it's really important when you're running any initiative that you hope to improve retention, that you're always have some kind of control group that is not exposed to whatever change that you're going to make. And that control group is basically representing everything else that's going on the platform, because it's quite a volatile number typically. So we always had a group of users who never received any notifications. And then we would test our new notifications with test groups, and A/B test all the while with copy, with timing, with the different kind of mix and combination of notifications that we would send. So there's a lot of experiments to run, and just as Max was saying, it's something that's never really done. It's never really finished. So yeah, like SoundCloud will continue to iterate on these notifications to build out new types. And I think the next phase, now that we have sort of a pretty cool notification system, is that they'll start to add like a layer of intelligence on top of that. So getting smarter about optimizing for relevance of notifications, which is super important. And yeah, so sort of final points just on like how to build good notifications. It's really all about personalization. And again, this kind of comes back to the point about iteration. So we have a reactivation notification that we send to users when we haven't seen them in the app for 5 days at SoundCloud. Because we figured out, again through testing, that 5 days was a good time to interact with the user before they're really likely to churn completely, but they're already sort of at risk of churn at that point. So we'd send them a notification, and probably like a lot of people who start off with reactivation, we started with something very basic. It was like, hey, come back and find more music on SoundCloud. Like basically just a very generic, like, we miss you kind of message. And yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, the click rate was super poor. The impact was, it was still worth having, but it was pretty minimal. And so we thought, okay, how can we iterate on that? So what we ended up with, which was performing way better, was a kind of a 3-tiered approach where we look at like, okay, has this user shown some kind of engagement within the app that we can use in our reactivation message? So we looked at, has a user liked a track? Because that's a really high level of engagement if they've actually hit the like button. And so if a user has liked a track in the past, we look at the last track that they liked, and in that reactivation message, we say, hey, not just come back and find some more music on SoundCloud, but we say, hey, come back and find some more music from artist X. Artist X being the creator of the track that they liked. And if they haven't liked a track, then we look at the last track that they played, and we use that as a signal, and we personalize it in the same way. So if I listen to a Britney Spears track, it's my last track, then we'd say, hey, come back and find more music from Britney Spears. And we found that these, by using what you know about the user's usage history, in those messages, you can really increase the click rate dramatically. I mean, I think it was something like a 5x increase in our click rate, albeit from a very low base. Yeah, time of day can also be pretty important. It's probably a good idea not to be sending push notifications to people in the middle of the night. Of course, if it's a real-time notification, if it's important enough, maybe some people want to be woken up. But yeah, it's like, again, it's something to test. And yeah, really importantly, also to give users like granular control over notifications. If they can just opt in or out of notifications in general, that's going to really limit your like boldness when you're testing new things, because like you'll be worried about people opting out of push notifications altogether, which is a valid concern. If you give users the option to opt out of every individual class of notifications, so in other words, say, I want to be told about new tracks, but I don't care if people are following me, I don't want to be notified about that. By giving people that granular level of control, you can be like more experimental and try bigger ideas, because likely that they'll just opt out of that particular type of notification rather than all of your notifications. So you can minimize and mitigate against negative impact. Yep, that's it. That's my short lessons learned on building an activity notification system. And yep, thanks very much.